I don't have a lot of experience lecturing, so ahead of time I want to apologize to you that I'm going to be reading my lecture rather than speaking extemporaneously, but that is for your sake, so that we keep a nice steady course here. Although my children would probably say, Mom, you have a lot of experience lecturing. So, but I'm sure they would also say it's not always on a steady course, so this is good. So when John asked me to share a woman's approach to reclaiming the household, I immediately knew what I wanted to speak to you all about. It's something very near to my heart, this burgeoning understanding of which has changed my experience of the household dramatically. I should actually say not just dramatically, but essentially. It's essentially changed my experience of our household and myself as a member of the household. I would like to talk to you today about the sticky and unpopular topic of submission and authority in the household. So, like, why do I have to go for the jugular? Why can't I just talk on something easy like decorating or something? But I'll tell you why I want to speak on that. It really made a huge difference to me to come to a better understanding of that. And the first part of that understanding was to realize that I, as a devout Catholic who chose marriage, and I chose to be a stay-at-home mom, it was an incredibly surprising awakening for me, or dawning, that I was not comfortable with the concept. And that I, like many other people, and from the reading of St. Paul that says the submission of wives, like to kind of, let's give a nuanced interpretation of this text. And so it was rather shocking for me to discover that I wasn't comfortable, and a little bit disconcerting, a lot disconcerting. And then through a really, I'm so grateful, gift of grace at a moment of insight, I felt like I was able to see or understand what the call to submission in marriage meant for me, and in trying to live that, it has dramatically changed my experience as a woman of the household. So this is obviously a huge topic. It's much bigger than the time that we have together really allows for, but I'm hoping that maybe it can be just a springboard, and maybe what we can do is we continue having conversation about it. But most importantly, it's really from my heart. I would like to share this with the other women here present, because it has so improved my experience of my home, and I would like to share that with you all. This is a challenging topic, or let's not mince words, it's downright hard for many reasons, and not the least of which is the antithetical stance against it in the world we live in. However, I think we cannot avoid the issue, as too much is at stake in it. I would like to suggest that the very ability to fully actualize our masculinity and femininity is at stake, our ability to be who we're designed to be. I would like to start the discussion by looking at the issue from a woman's point of view, first of all, because I'm a woman and that perspective is more connatural for me. And John asked me to speak on a woman's perspective of reclaiming the home, so that. But secondly, also because the rub with submission and authority really seems to lie more with the women than the men. I'm tempted to say that it's more difficult to submit than to exercise authority, and in some respects that is true, but as I think about it, I think it's just as challenging to exercise true authority. So while we ladies like to say, oh, well, you have it easy, you don't have to submit, I think actually the reality is the exercise of true authority in the family and the household is equally as difficult. However, I'd like to approach this talk from the woman's as I approach it from the woman's perspective. In a lot of ways, it's my conversation heart to heart with the women here. I do want to encourage and invite the men to be fully present here. Sorry, you can't sleep during this one. I'd like for you to try to stay awake and pay attention, because ultimately this is about you also. What I wanted to say from the heart before I go on to the other woman here is something to make your burden lighter. I love my husband, I'm deeply grateful for my children, and for the home that we have together. I will confess to you that for me, the choice to stay at home and be a homemaker has been exceedingly difficult, and sometimes even bitterly so, in spite of the fact that I know that what I have chosen is good, and it's my choice, and I want it. That it was so hard was disturbing to me. It didn't seem like it should be so hard, at least not for someone like me. I think it might be like this for a lot of the good women that I know, and probably so for a lot of the women that I don't know. I tried to come to a greater peace in my vocation by growing in a better understanding and greater skill in my craft, by reading everything I could, from Edith Stein to Marie Kondo and the Japanese way of tidying, to managers of their home, and Julia Child, and even Joanna Gaines, to mention a very few. All these things definitely contributed to my appreciation and were definitely a source of diversion and sometimes even escape. But none of them actually solved my problem. What's the point of all this? I know I'm indispensably important to seven other people, but what's the big picture? The big picture began to take shape for me when John was beginning to hone in on the household in his philosophical work, and it became the substance of our pillow talk and lots of other talk as well. I'm so grateful and deeply, deeply indebted. I began to see the big picture, and the big picture is so much more beautiful than I could have ever guessed. I'm beginning to see that the big picture is that the household is the place where we are offered an opportunity to become more human, where I am offered an opportunity to become most me, most feminine, most Sofia. And it's the place where John has the same opportunity. It's something that we do together. Nay, even more so and more importantly, it is something that we make possible for one another. And at the very heart of what we do for one another, page change. And at the very heart of what we do for one another that makes this fulfillment possible is authority and submission. I know that I'm only beginning to grasp a little bit of what that means, but I would like to share with you what I've experienced here today. And I'd like to approach it in this way. First, I would like to paint a clear picture of what femininity is, at least in its most complete form, so that we have an image of what we, as women of the household, are striving for, and so that we understand what femininity is not. Then next, I'd like to consider the context necessary for complete actualization of our femininity and how the household in particular provides that very context. And then finally, I'd like to consider a few aspects of our role as women of the household. So first, to give you an image, because when we have an image, it's so much easier to go toward an image. When it's just vague or even just words, sometimes it's hard for us to know where we're going. So I'd like to paint this image for you by quoting Edith Stein. This is a really beautiful quote from an actual presentation that she made to the Department of State in Germany on fundamental principles of women's education. It's rather a remarkable document, pretty short. But in it she says, "The soul of woman must be expansive and open to all human beings. It must be quiet so that no small, weak flame will be extinguished by stormy winds. Warm so as not to benumb fragile buds. Empty of itself in order that extraneous life may have room in it. And finally, mistress of itself, the feminine soul, and also of its body, so that the entire person is readily at the disposal of every call." The word that's most often and best used to describe this quality of woman is receptive. This characteristic can even be more intensely described as vulnerable, in the sense that when we use the word vulnerable, we often think of our capacity to be hurt, but not so much the capacity to be hurt, but rather that there's no exterior or hard defense that keeps out that which would wound. So it's not having a hard surface of defense. It allows things to pass through. It's able to be wounded, but we're not focusing on the hurting part, but rather the condition that allows things to pass through. This is the fundamental characteristic of the feminine soul. Woman is described as having a particular capacity to be vulnerable, to let others and their needs, hopes, and desires to pass through to their closest heart. However, girls, like all human beings, come into this world with an instinct to preserve their own life. It is an instinct to protect oneself from what is harmful. It's a good instinct, and the practice of it is indeed, in certain circumstances, appropriate and even imperative. However, this stance of defense is antithetical to a woman's design to be receptive. A woman can only really be able to practice being fully receptive where she does not have to protect herself but can depend on someone else protecting her. In the order of nature, that protection is provided for a woman when she is a child by her father. And I would really love to talk about this some more, but this is not the topic of the conversation here, but maybe someone can ask me it during the question and answer period. Okay, but most ultimately, so a young girl is protected by her father in the home, but most ultimately that complete protection is provided for her in the context of marriage. Okay, so gentlemen, this is where I would really ask you to listen, because we as women really depend on you hearing this and understanding it, because I'm going to talk about a little bit how that ability to become fully vulnerable and to fully exercise our capacity to nurture is actually dependent on our husband in the context of marriage. When a man asks a woman to marry him and she accepts, a new third entity comes into being by virtue of their love and commitment. The household. So this is even before a child comes into the marriage. This is when they make their first commitment. This third being comes into existence, which is the household. It's comprised of the children, which will be the fruit of their love, and all of the other persons that will be added to the household, as well as the material things that make up their household. When a man initiates this household by asking the woman he loves to marry him, he has first authority for this new entity and assumes responsibility for it and for the flourishing of all of those in this new entity, all those who make up the household, starting with his wife. His total responsibility for the flourishing of his wife is a commitment to provide the protection that she needs in order to give up her work of self-protection. His commitment is total, his responsibility is total, his protection is total. When a man exercises his authority and assumes responsibility for the household, he makes it possible for his wife to be truly feminine. She no longer has to have this stance to the world, but can have this stance to the world, and in particular to her family. This is the context that truly allows a woman to actualize her full potential, to be receptive, sensitive, generous, and nurturing. There is another context, but we can set that aside for right now, and someone can ask me about that in the question and answer period. Okay, so all this total protection, total responsibility, total authority sounds really intimidating, and frankly, on the practical level, it sounds kind of not realistic. So gentlemen, don't worry. But it's the intention that makes the difference. And it makes all the difference. So we can't always practice it perfectly, but it's the intention of the man when he asks a woman to join him in marriage, that he will provide that for her. And then that's what the rest of the marriage is about. It's about the daily striving to better love, better serve, better care for. And this is the work of marriage. This is its beauty. But it's not enough for a woman to be protected by her husband's protection. She needs to accept his authority to receive the benefit of it. She has to allow him to exercise first authority, first over herself, and then the rest of the family. Having a bodyguard or a fall guy does not yield this kind of protection that allows a woman to be vulnerable. It's an interior disposition that orders her relationship to her husband and the whole household. When she accepts his authority and headship, not only does she enter into a context where she can be truly feminine, she actually also provides the context in which he can fully actuate his own masculinity. This is the beautiful design of profound reciprocity in marriage. To lovingly give oneself totally to the other allows each to be most fully themselves. There's so much to be said on how headship and obedience plays itself out in a practical sense. And I'm hoping that maybe we can touch on those more in the question and answer period a little bit later this afternoon, shortly after this talk, but also in the afternoon session we'll have, hopefully we really would love to hear your questions and really start a conversation and discussion with you on these topics. But But I just want to take a quick look before I end here, and I want to take a look at a few things in the light of femininity, of what femininity and submission is not. Okay, so very often the feminine characteristic of receptivity is subtly merged and conflated with passivity. But the role of woman in the household is anything but passive. So sorry, ladies, we cannot let the guys take the full burden. The household comes into being not when the man initiates it by inviting a woman to join him in marriage, but when she says yes. She has an active role in the birth, so to speak, of the household. He initiates and has the first authority, and she, by volitionally agreeing, also has real authority over the household. This authority is subordinate to his, but is nonetheless a real participation in his authority. In this way, the wife also shares a responsibility for the flourishing of the members of the household. And as such, she must always be striving to look to the needs of her household and to discern what is necessary for their flourishing. This is where her particular gift of receptivity stands greatly in her stead. Her open heart more readily perceives the needs of others, and her ability to nurture is anxious to find out how to meet their needs. She also bears the responsibility to form her intellect and mind better, to be able to understand what those needs are and what, in fact, is the best way for the needs to be met. This assiduous looking toward the needs of her family and her gift for perception give rise to another important aspect of her role in the household. Far from being passive, she must be her husband's support in an active way, in the sense of being his capable boots on the ground. Often a woman's sensitivity allows her to see and understand the inner workings and needs, not only of the children, but of the whole interaction of the household. Her husband, whose gifts lie in other areas, nevertheless needs her critical information to exercise his authority rightly and effectively. It is the woman's role to tirelessly, without nagging, bring these insights to bear on household decisions. It seems crummy that being really good at gathering the information, we don't get to make the final decision. But it goes the other way too. It must be crummy to be responsible for a decision that you have to rely on someone else's information to make. But in reality, neither is crummy. It's actually a design that drives us toward relationship. It requires that we make this household together over and over again, a constant communication between spouses. Indeed, it is not good for man to live alone. It's always better together. I would just like to close by sharing with you my personal experience and how I came to understand this in our marriage. I'm pretty capable. And so at times it's been a little bit hard for me to let John be first authority. And I found that through a good portion of our marriage, things were going great. He's really sweet. He's very thoughtful and considerate. I'm very kind and warm and loving, but it just felt like there was kind of a tension that was going on. And the children were getting older, and decisions had to be made. We would discuss them, good communication, and there was tension. And then I can remember exactly where I was standing one time, fretting over an issue that we had a disagreement about how it should be solved. And I was so frustrated because, very confident in my abilities of perception, I was sure that my approach to fixing the problem was correct rather than his approach to fixing the problem. And this was why I just really account it to grace. It was like a moment of grace. God said to me, I felt like he said to me, I just all of a sudden had this image of standing before God on the judgment day and him saying, actually, I'm not going to ask you why this turned out this way. I'm going to ask him, because that was his job. And all of a sudden I became aware that maybe part of the reason it was incredibly hard for me to figure out my way through and all these decisions were so difficult is because I don't have the grace to make that decision. That is the grace given to the husband of the family. I also don't have the responsibility, and boy, that felt really good, that God looked at me and said, oh, I'm not going to ask you, I'm going to ask him. So, it sounds kind of cheap to say it was this moment of like unbelievable relief that this is not my problem. I mean, so obviously it's not completely not my problem. But it also illustrated to me that this is the nature of the gift of authority in a marriage situation. I have certain gifts that make me vulnerable and very malleable and pliable, a warm place where my children can come. If I also share the burden of responsibility, it takes something away from my ability to do that. And I realized this incredible moment of relief that I don't have to bear the burden of that first authority. That this is what my husband not only can and should bear, but offers me. But I just wasn't taking it. So the table was laid for the feast, but I wasn't coming to the table. So I found that the feast of marriage is much more delicious when you come to the table. And I just want to finish that example by then also saying something completely extraordinary and unlooked for in my experience. So this is reminding me a little bit of how John in his earlier talk this morning said, only those who have done it can know. And I kind of feel like it was this kind of moment for me of being frustrated, feeling a little bit like, oh, my skills aren't being met in this marriage situation. There are more that I could do. I can't do it. I'm taking care of kids. There was a kind of frustration involved there. When I accepted this relationship of headship and authority, it gave me incredible relief and freedom to move, but also almost more extraordinarily because it was totally unlooked for, it changed John's relationship in our family. He began to take on the mantle of authority and responsibility in a completely different way. This is a man who is extremely intentional in everything that he does, as you may have noticed. And unlike a lot of young men who get married, who sometimes I say, thank God we don't know what we're getting into when we get married, but he really took it seriously and really has tried to be a responsible and good husband who cares for his family. When I gave him the authority over our family, it completely changed his stance. It was as though he was like this in our family, and then he stood up like this. So, it's not like he wasn't loving or caring or responsible before, but I realized that by my giving him first authority, I was enabling him to fully exercise his masculinity, which he was trying to do, but because I was not allowing him to do that, it provided a frustration for him that was curtailing his masculinity. And so on the other side, I want to share that my experience has been that so many of the frustrations that we have in marriage and in parenting, especially for us as women, because we choose to limit our sphere for the sake of those who have been entrusted to us, it becomes a completely different experience when we live it in a relationship with our spouse that is actually mutually giving. He, by giving care and protection and his authority, and me by receiving his authority and accepting his headship. So that's my anecdotal, of course, we've only lived it for a little bit, relatively speaking, but it has materially changed my experience, and so I just want to share that with you as a encouragement. We've had a lot of bracing things to hear today, and maybe this will be an encouragement to move forward and enjoy some of the fruits of this great thing that we're endeavoring to do. So that wraps up what I wanted to share with you all, and I think I left a lot of things in ellipsis, but I'm hoping that that's an invitation to you all for questions. If not now, then maybe a little bit after dinner. So. So Nicholas, you have a question. Should we try to do the microphone, or let's perfect. Let's see how that carries. Speak from authority. Okay.
Would you, in your experience with God, share some of the practical manifestations of authentic authority and feminine active receptivity?
Yeah. So in a lot of the day-to-day things that we experience, there's a constant conversation going on between us. And so I very much experience it as me bringing information to John. There's a lot of information that I have that he can't have, partially because he's not in the home as much as I am, just physically, the time spent here. Plus, very much so, my insight into our children and their relationships and their relationship with us. These are things that I have found really make a substance of our conversation about what we're going to do about things. Usually, decisions that we make about practical matters come pretty smoothly just through conversation, and almost always we are in agreement about what we're going to do. So it's not an intense experience of headship and submission. There have been definitive moments in our marriage where we have had to make a hard decision, usually having to do with something to do with the guidance of the children. It's rarely in financial things or things like that, and where we have had a real disagreement about what we should do. What I have learned, and I initially started doing this out of an intellectual conviction that the right approach is to let him have the final say. Now, I have to say it was a little bit poisoned with this feeling of, and when it goes bad, I'm going to say I told you so. But I didn't say that. I mean, I'm trying to be virtuous here. But I will tell you another thing that I discovered is that very often the decision that John made, in contrast to my judgment, actually ended up being what was best for the family. Now, there's no guarantee of that, right? This is what men have to be willing to take on. I'm going to make the final decision. I'm going to do my best to make it be the right decision. It might not be the right decision. But one thing that I learned is that while women have a tremendous capacity and insight into things, the husband in the family does bring to the conversation a unique insight, which is a masculine insight, which is very important in getting to the truth of the matter. And I had to really learn that the hard way because I'm not a terribly docile person and I have a high estimation of my intellectual capacity. That, in fact, there was something I didn't see that he could see better than I precisely because he was a man. Men have a different approach to things, right? And very often that's what comes out in the conversation we're having. I'll say, well, what about this? And he'll say, well, what about this? I go, oh, that's a good point. But so...
Dear, can I give a specific example?
I'll think about it. I give you permission.
Just because let's just go ahead and go concrete. We can do this without sacrificing our children too much.
That's his
I'm just going to
judgment.
give you the opportunity to take this and run with it. I'm not trying to take over your... one of the hardest ones that we've dealt with each successive child is one to let them have a phone. All right? And that, I bet, if you had asked Sofia what was the biggest thing, and this is the thing, I think it's important to say this. We still don't know whether we made the right decision, quote, the right decision. Mm-hmm. But we did our best, and in that sense, it is the right decision. But I think that was one of the big moments where it was actually very hard for me. We simply disagreed. I was actually, believe it or not, I think it's going to sacrifice relationship with this child if we don't give this child a phone. And Sofia was very rightfully concerned about bad things that can happen that are out of your control. And so there was this impasse, and to some extent, I just wanted to walk away, right? But that was the moment where I realized, all right, this is one of the things I've been thinking about and praying about. We simply have a disagreement, and so I've got to make the decision. And it was very unpleasant. And I made that decision, and sometimes the pillow talk is still not sure whether that was right or not. So it's not the thing here of authority, if I may just add, it's not as though we know that at that moment, if a woman lets the man make the final decision, it will be the right one. In a sense, the right decision is the best we can do in that moment in our relationship. And our relationship grew a lot from that.
Yeah, I was going to say that maybe the one, we don't know for sure whether that was the right decision from the perspective of the phone question. But in my conceding to my husband or allowing him to make the final decision, that was the right decision. And that had a very important impact on our relationship. So in a certain sense, that was the part that was the good part of that decision. So does that help a little bit?
That's great.
Okay. Yes, Jenna.
Okay, so asking for a friend. There are typical feminine and masculine character traits, and there's a wide range of personalities that people of each gender have.
Yes.
And, okay, so what if you have a man in the relationship who's very intuitive and good at feelings and a woman who is not? Mm-hmm. Like what do you even do with that if, like, the feminine role is to tell the man about feelings?
Yeah, so it's actually, the feminine role isn't, thank you so much for that question. That was definitely between the lines. I was saying, oh, I hope somebody asks me about this, because that is very much true. I mean, in some ways, I'm on the feminine side, but I'm not on the super feminine side, so I totally get your friend's question. But, so this is also not to say that just because a woman is intuitive and perceptive that she has proprietorship over those abilities. There are definitely men who have greater gifts in understanding intuition, perception, and that's wonderful. That actually in a lot of ways makes the relationship situation much easier. Often I say to the Lord, why did you think this was going to be a good idea? Just because it's like men and women think so differently. So in a certain sense, it makes it a little bit easier. However, I will say that a man's perceptiveness and intuition is still going to be a masculine perceptiveness and intuition. And I think that makes all the difference. And you can have women who aren't really, I don't want to say touchy-feely or aren't effusive or gushing, that nevertheless have a particular way of embracing a person to the heart that's different from the way a man does. And so if you as a woman don't have what would appear on paper or on a Hallmark movie as very feminine characteristics, that does not mean that you don't have this capacity of soul to open your arms and to embrace unconditionally. It's going to be different for different women, depending on what their temperament is, their disposition, their habits, etc. Just as masculinity is different for men, depending on what their temperament is. Edith Stein really talks a lot about, when she talks about the feminine soul, she says the feminine characteristic and then the personal characteristic. Each woman's going to be different. I do think that what is helpful, and actually maybe it's a good thing if your friend doesn't have kind of a lot of the overt characteristics, because it actually pushes you to go, well, what's really at the heart of what a woman's gift is? And it might not be baking brownies, even though that's what it looks like, or interior decorating, but it is an expansiveness of heart, that she says a woman's heart should be expansive so as to not exclude anything, so that nothing would be alien there. If we struggle with that as women, then it would be a good thing for us to explore how can we become more open-hearted and generous so that life can be safe here. There are a lot of reasons why women, and this is the question about fatherhood and girls that I was hoping someone was going to ask me. If we grow up in an environment that is not supportive or protective, then very often a girl will grow up with habits of defensiveness that don't go away just because a man asked her to marry her. And so we as women, it's part of what is incumbent upon us, just as it is on a man in a marriage situation. When we have a household, it's incumbent upon us to grow in knowledge and understanding, one of ourselves, our relationship, children, and all the things within our household, so we become better at doing those things. So I think it's an invitation to go, well, what really is at the heart of femininity? And that if you have a husband who's very intuitive, that's great, that's more information, but the conversation still has to happen, and there will be something unique that the woman offers that conversation. So I hope that answers your question. Good. Yes, Miriam.
I would like you to talk about father-daughter.
Oh, wow, what a surprise, Miriam. Thank you for asking that.
Repeat the question.
So Miriam asked if I would just talk a little bit about the father-daughter relationship. I mean, John, rightfully so, in his talk really talks a lot about the importance of the father in bringing out the son and educing from him his masculinity and his comfort in the world that he lives in. And so it's kind of seems like tough stuff that the burden for a woman being fully feminine should be laid at the door of the father, but in a certain sense, this is what first authority really means. It means that the man has responsibility for the household and everything in it. First responsibility. So while it feels like, oh, it's kind of a lot, the guy's responsible for the sons and the daughters, we have to remember this responsibility is couched in love. So would a man say, oh, just give me less responsibility? I don't want to. No, he wants to give his son an environment that helps him be a man. He wants to do that for his daughter. So in writing this and thinking about it, I was very, very struck about this kind of suppleness that is part of a woman's femininity, her identity of who she is as a woman, and how even though it can be fully actuated in a marriage situation, what happens when a woman who has become accustomed to being protective and hard, protective and hard, protective and hard, goes into a marriage situation, it's very difficult because she's going to be in union with what she's practiced. And so it's hard for her to then to all of a sudden develop these skills of tenderness and openness and nurturing. And so it struck me that the very thing that the husband offers to his wife in marriage is actually what the father offers to his daughter in his household. He assumes responsibility for her. He assumes the responsibility to see and understand what are her needs. He cares and protects her. And so this is why I think we don't really, people get married at such different ages and the father is not always present to be able to give the daughter away. But if you have a picture of a traditional wedding, when the father walks the bride down the aisle, he gives her hand to the groom at the front of the church. He is literally handing over the care of her and the protection of her to her husband. And it's almost as though it's this seamless, or it ought to be this seamless handing over from one protection to the next. And I think that's really beautiful, and I'd like to underscore that because I think sometimes fathers, by a lack of connaturality with their daughters, it's more intuitive to know what I need to do for my son. Oh, it's what I really wanted from my dad. It's not so intuitive for dads to know what they need to do for their daughters. So first of all, your wife will tell you if there's any confusion in the details. But second of all, to be aware that you have this relationship to your daughter of being an umbrella of care for her. It's not necessarily something that you're saying, but it's the intention that determines your attitude and spirit toward it, and also your awareness. Your daughter turns 16, she's driving, she's going to work, okay, she's kind of independent. No, I'm responsible for her and for her care and for her safety. What do I need to do to extend that care of her into this new environment? And so it just really struck me that what a dad does for his daughter in that regard helps prepare her to be able to more fully blossom in the relationship with her husband. And to be able to give her the tools to be able to have the suppleness that she needs to nurture life in her household and family. How are we doing on time, sweetheart?
I don't know.
Oh,
What time is it?
I think we have a little bit of time.
I think we do too.
Yeah.
Do you mind if, and someone else had a question there, do you mind if I just say one thing that what you just said
Please.
tipped off in my mind?
Yep.
It's very challenging for me. Ask my wife, I should more often have, as regards our daughters, said, what do you think so-and-so is going through right now, and what does she need from me? And I'm consistently almost overwhelmed, but I shouldn't say overwhelmed because it need not be overwhelming. The attention it takes for the involved father, especially as girls grow, and I feel we tend, as they start to become teenagers, in both sexes tend to think, okay, well now they're going to be more on their own. What is she facing? What is she feeling right now? That I go to you and say, what do you think the struggle is right now? Where is she with her friends? The kind of individual attention that calls for is remarkable. And if she experiences that from me, that's the kind of individual attention that she'll expect and call out and receive from her husband. But if I'm not giving that, she's gonna, like you said, she's gonna learn to put her hand up because she'll have to, especially in such a brutal world.
Yeah, and I have to say, this posture of a hand up has been one of the most painful experiences for us in our marriage. There have been many times when I've put my hand up like this, and out of habit, out of unwillingness to actually be supple and receive affection, or maybe courage that a problem can be worked out, and that has been exceedingly painful in our marriage I mean, as it would be either way, but certainly to go like this is very painful. Any other questions?
What exactly?
Oh, just I feel like that describes keeping something out. Like it seems like it's part of a healthy emotional immune system that if something negative is attacking you or something that's not good for you, that you have an emotional immune system which says, no, you can't do that. And this is an appropriate response in many circumstances if someone is being abusive of you, taking advantage of you, etc. Obviously, the kind of this emotional stance, I'm doing this physically because you might not be doing it with your hands, but there's a spiritual demeanor which says, no, stay out, pushing back. Very often that is, expresses itself in angry words, harsh tone. That's a verbal way of expressing a spiritual stance of stay away from me, stay out. And marriage is not supposed to be that. It's supposed to be two people who have so permanently committed themselves to one another in love that there is a profound interpenetration all the time. It requires tremendous trust, a trust that can only come as a fruit of a permanent commitment, to keep trying and to see better and to know better. Oh, yes.
Hi. So the pragmatic side of me wants to ask,
Beautiful.
this transfer of authority to John, you said it didn't happen too long ago, but was it something that happened over time, or was it one day you just had a conversation and you stated it, or did you sign an agreement? Like, what did that look like?
Well, he made me put it in writing. I would say it's a little bit of a combination of both. I mean, actually, kind of extraordinary it was. I experienced it as a moment of recognition, intellectual recognition of the circumstances. And that was a definitive moment for me. There was much leading up to the moment, right? So we were trying really hard to do this thing well. And I think the Lord blesses those efforts. We're poking around in the dark, and he finally puts the target in front of us. Okay, you got it. So, but for me, it was a definitive moment. I don't remember exactly the practical details. Maybe you do. I mean, I do picture myself saying to John, I realize I have not given you full authority over our family, and I'm done with that. I'm now going to give you full authority. You know, I don't exactly remember the moment of saying that, but we have had an explicit understanding. But honestly, I feel like our relationship and his experience of me changed dramatically without my saying that. But I guess you'll have to ask him.
May I just say one thing? I don't like the word of transfer of authority. She didn't give up anything. She still has authority. And so I appreciate the question, but if I may put it this way, when now she's able to act her authority, and I find myself able to respect it and allow her to do that, because there's not something in me that is feeling threatened. That, in other words, there's something in me that naturally recognizes, I suppose, I should take kind of final responsibility. But transferring authority could make it sound as though she realized, I don't have to worry about this. I'm not involved. She should be more intimately involved. I can't exercise my authority without her. But we were more always pushing against one another, and this is the beauty of the plan. Again, it's sometimes hard to put it into words, but if I accept the ultimate authority, that gives her the space where she has to do her part, or I am going to fail. I'm in no way doing it by myself. And I think when by God's plan, we feel our way more into this, it tends to happen seamlessly. You talk, you agree, you do it. You talk, you agree, you do it. It's funny. It's the more I think we're able to start to do it. I'm not at all saying we're perfect at doing it. It comes so naturally. You recognize that at the end of the day, I'm going to take kind of the full responsibility for this. But in the enacting of it, you very much experience it as we are totally in this together. It's never me going solo, and it's never me leaving her solo. It's always two fully engaged, discerning and acting together. That's just why I wanted to say, don't think of transferring as though she realized that she needed to fade back. She doesn't need to fade back. And maybe this comes back to James's question about, to some extent, maybe she was pushing her hand in my face a little bit.
I'll describe it.
Oh, you have one.
I guess I'll describe it this way. This is a little bit going back to Nicholas's question. There were times that we would make the same judgment, and so we would be on the same page. Okay, everything's going constant. But it's almost like two people saying, okay, tell me what you think. Okay, that's what I'm going to do. Okay, yeah, I'll agree. Okay, we'll do it together, which is two separate people. So we're not in conflict. There's no, but it's not a unified togetherness, right? And so all of a sudden, in this kind of experience of, again, as John said, it's like entering into the umbrella or into his authority. And I said in my talk that it's a real authority, which is subordinate, meaning without taking anything away from his primary authority, but it's a real authority that is through his authority. It's mine, really, but it's through our relationship that I experience this. That's the problem when people are saying, oh, a marriage is two people agreeing and kind of being equal and just going it together. That sounds really great, but not really. That's two separate people. I didn't sign up for this to be separate. I want to be together with someone, right? And this is kind of the intimate, this is the understanding of authority that allows you to be in it actually together, rather than two separate people who actually are very nice and so they don't fight. No, like we actually want to, and I will say, I have to regularly practice reminding myself of first authority and second authority. A lot. And I have to remind myself a lot. Just because his way is foreign, it doesn't mean it's wrong. I'm just saying that to the ladies. I'm sorry, the male thing is very foreign to me, and after all these years, it's still pretty foreign. But the good thing that I've learned is that it's just another way, and that it has its validity. So.
And I have to realize I have to step up. It constantly calls me out where I would have rather faded out, gone back to writing a lecture. I got to get involved. Dear, we're going to have to, the
Good.
time, thank you. So, and this
Okay,
is to be continued. I'm going to have Mike Brown come
Yeah.
up and talk about lunch. I need a couple men to help me set up just a couple more tables so everyone will have some place to sit. And
so the schedule is we're going to have lunch right now.
lunch will be served in
And
8 minutes.
And we're hoping to give you ample opportunity to continue conversations with one another over the tables, and we hope that you'll really do this, so that we'll come back to the session after lunch with lots of good questions and lots of discussion back and forth, because that is really what drives the practical details, is where people are in particular.